A referee, $50,000, and a match that was never supposed to be fair. Eala walked onto that court believing she had earned her place, and she had. What she hadn't counted on was that someone had already decided the outcome before the first serve. When the truth detonated across the tennis world, it didn't just spark outrage, it ignited a reckoning, because this wasn't simply about one match, one official, or one young woman's heartbreak. This was about a system that smiles at power and devours the vulnerable. What you're about to discover will make your jaw drop and your blood boil. 500 words. Let them count. There are athletes who rise because the system embraces them, and then there are athletes who rise despite it. Eala belongs fiercely, irrevocably to the second category. Born in the Philippines at a time when Southeast Asian women in professional tennis were treated as curiosities rather than competitors, Eala never had the luxury of doubt. Doubt was not something her circumstances permitted. Every flight she boarded, every tournament she entered, every drill she survived in the pre-dawn Manila humidity, all of it was done with the quiet, ferocious understanding that she was representing something far greater than a ranking. She had been called a prodigy since childhood, but prodigies are fragile things unless they are forged with intention. Eala's intention was steel. She trained under Rafael Nadal's academy in Mallorca, Spain, absorbing methods and discipline that elite European teenagers took for granted, while she simultaneously carried the weight of a nation's hope across an ocean. She did not complain. Complaining was not on the schedule. By the time she reached the WTA main tour in a serious capacity, she had already accumulated junior Grand Slam titles, ITF victories, and a reputation for staying calm under the kind of pressure that causes far more experienced players to collapse. She was, by every objective measure, the real deal. Not a project, not a marketing experiment, a professional athlete of genuine quality. Her coach at the time noted publicly that Eala possessed something rare, competitive intelligence. She didn't just hit the ball. She read situations, adjusted, recalibrated. She played like someone who understood that talent alone never suffices, that survival in professional sports demands tactical brilliance matched to physical capability. Those around her spoke of her composure with the kind of reverence usually reserved for veterans twice her age. So when she arrived at this particular tournament, a mid-level WTA event that nonetheless carried significant ranking points and prize money, nobody who watched her warming up would have predicted what was about to unfold. She was focused. She was prepared. The draw had not been merciful, but it had been fair, and fairness was all Eala had ever asked for. She trusted the process. She trusted the institution. She had no reason not to. That trust was about to be demolished, because somewhere in that tournament facility, in a conversation that was never supposed to surface, a referee, a designated official whose sworn professional obligation was the integrity of every match conducted under their authority, was being handed an envelope. Inside that envelope, $50,000, and the name of the player who was supposed to lose. Nobody on that court knew it yet. The fans didn't know. The broadcasters didn't know. Eala herself, stretching in the locker room, reviewing match tactics, believing in the sanctity of the competition she was about to enter, she didn't know. But she was about to find out, and when she did, nothing would ever be the same. Here is the truth about injustice. It rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, dressed in bureaucratic clothing, wrapped in the language of procedure. It looks from a distance like an ordinary bad day. For Eala, the first sign arrived in the opening set. The calls were strange, not dramatically strange, not the kind of obvious, shameless distortion that any spectator could identify immediately. No, these were the subtle kind, the kind that accumulate. A serve called out that landed by the most forgiving of interpretations, on the line. A forehand winner from Eala that triggered a challenge and somehow, improbably, was reversed despite footage that appeared to contradict the ruling. A foot fault called at a moment of particular pressure, a moment that broke Eala's rhythm at precisely the wrong juncture. Individually, any one of these calls might be forgiven. Line calls are inherently subjective at elite levels. Officials make errors, players contest them, move on, adapt. This is the understood contract of professional tennis. But Eala was watching more than the calls. She was watching the pattern. Her opponent, a player ranked higher, better resourced, representing a country whose tennis federation wielded considerably more institutional influence, seemed to benefit from every margin, every close moment, every borderline ruling, every brief pause in play where the referee interjected. It all tilted in one direction. The accumulation became impossible to ignore. By the end of the first set, she had lost it. Not because she had been outplayed. The statistics, which would later be dissected in obsessive detail by analysts and fans alike, told a different story. She had won more baseline exchanges, her first serve percentage was higher, her unforced error count was lower. She had, by all technical measures, dominated the first set in terms of actual tennis. And yet, the scoreboard said otherwise. Between sets, sources close to the match later described the atmosphere in Eala's corner as tense but controlled. Her team was beginning to sense what she already felt. Something was wrong. Not in the abstract, paranoid way that losing players sometimes manufacture explanations for their own failures, but concretely, measurably, demonstrably wrong. In the second set, Eala raised her level. This is where her character announced itself undeniably. Rather than collapsing under the weight of what she was experiencing, she sharpened. Every stroke carried increased intention. She moved faster, read the court with greater precision, forced exchanges she knew she could win cleanly, without relying on the margins where the calls had been costing her. For a stretch of games, it seemed she might wrestle control of the match entirely. The crowd, which had been politely observing, began to stir. There is a particular energy that gathers around an athlete who refuses to yield to circumstances, and Eala was generating that energy in quantities that were impossible to ignore. Then came the point. The specific point that broke everything open. A rally deep into the second set, a crucial game. Eala constructs a brilliant, exhausting sequence, draws her opponent out of position, and drives a clean cross-court winner that lands, visibly, undeniably, on the baseline. Court cameras captured it. Spectators in multiple sections of the stadium saw it. The sound it made on the court surface was unambiguous. The referee called it out. And something inside Alex Eala, something she had held with extraordinary discipline across an entire professional career built on composure, fractured. She stopped, she turned, and in a voice that carried across the court, across every nearby spectator, across the streaming audio that would be clipped and replayed thousands of times before midnight, she said it. You cheated. 2 words, an accusation. A rupture. The stadium went silent in the way that stadiums only go silent when something genuinely historic is unfolding. The referee was suspended pending investigation. Criminal referrals were initiated in the jurisdiction where the tournament had been held. The individuals connected to the betting network became subjects of a separate, broader probe involving multiple sports disciplines. These were significant consequences. They were, in the language of institutional response, robust. The WTA pointed to them as evidence of a system functioning as designed, capable of detecting and addressing corruption when it emerged. Critics, and there were many, pointed out a different truth. The system had not detected the corruption. The system had been forced to acknowledge corruption that an athlete detected, confronted publicly, and refused to let disappear. Without Eala's 2-word accusation on that court, without her visible, audible, impossible-to-ignore refusal to accept what was being done to her, the match would have ended, the results would have stood, and the envelope would have remained invisible. She had not benefited from institutional protection. She had, through sheer force of individual courage, compelled an institution to reckon with something it might otherwise have quietly buried. Her ranking points from the match were eventually adjusted. The result, tainted by the investigation's findings, was placed under review. These remedies were meaningful and also insufficient because there is no recovery for the psychological cost of competing in conditions that were rigged. There is no points allocation that repairs the damage of being cheated, publicly, in front of an audience, by someone entrusted with the power to determine whether your effort receives fair treatment. Eala spoke at length in an interview conducted several weeks after the incident. She did not perform anger for the cameras. She did not offer triumphalist declarations. She spoke with the measured clarity of someone who had processed something enormous and arrived at a place of complicated wisdom. "I trusted the process," she said. "That trust was violated. And I think what I learned is that trust has to be earned continuously. It cannot be assumed." Those words did not trend in the same way her confrontation had trended. They were not designed to. But they were, perhaps, more important. Legacy is not always constructed from victories. Sometimes the most enduring contributions to a sport are made by athletes who refuse to allow the sport to deceive itself. Eala Agla's confrontation and everything that followed it became a reference point. Not merely a moment, not merely a controversy, but a reference point. When athletes in other disciplines faced suspicious officiating in subsequent months, her name was invoked. When tennis governance discussions turned to referee accountability and transparency, her case formed part of the argument. When young players from countries with limited institutional influence asked whether speaking out was worth the professional risk, her story was the evidence offered. She had paid a cost. Confronting officials in professional sports carries consequences that persist beyond any single investigation, beyond any formal vindication. Institutional memory is long. The whisper network that labels athletes as difficult or emotional or unprofessional operates below the surface of any official record and can shape career trajectories in ways that are impossible to prove and equally impossible to deny. But the alternative, absorbing the injustice, accepting the defeat, competing again within a system she had witnessed committing fraud against her, was simply not something Eala was constitutionally capable of choosing. This is what separates her story from dozens of others that never surface. Not the corruption itself. Corruption in various forms has shadowed professional sports since the concept of professional sport was invented. What separates her story is the response, the refusal, the two words spoken at a volume that could not be managed, minimized, or explained away. The sport of tennis, with all its grandeur, its history, its traditions, its genuine beauty, is also a system. Systems develop blind spots. They develop self-protective reflexes. They develop over time a preference for their own continuity over individual justice. An athlete who forces a system to examine its blind spots is performing a service that the system will rarely thank them for in the moment and will inevitably, whether it acknowledges this or not, rely upon. Eala Agla forced tennis to examine itself. That is not a minor achievement. That is, in fact, the kind of thing that changes how a sport operates for the people who come after. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a 23-year-old from the Philippines hadn't said those two words out loud, in front of cameras, in front of a global audience, at the cost of everything composure is supposed to protect, would any of this have ever been exposed? And if the answer is no, what does that tell us about every match, every moment, every outcome we have accepted without question? Eala Agla didn't just win a battle against a crooked referee. She forced an entire sport to confront a question it had been avoiding. That takes a specific kind of courage, not the kind displayed in championship points, but the kind displayed when the entire institutional machinery is aligned against you and you speak anyway. Subscribe for more stories that tennis doesn't want told. Subscribe because the real game is never just on the court.